Thank you guys for having me. I'm Taylor Menard. I know many of you have already met me before, but I'm the Lake Water Quality Program Coordinator here at the City of Greater Sudbury. So today I'm just going to talk just like a brief primer on invasive Phragmites, what it is, how it differs from the native Phragmites that we do have as well, and then talk about some identifying features for the group to be able to help identify it, because sometimes when you're looking at it and you don't really know what the difference is, it just all looks kind of the same. But then I will point out a few key features, and then hopefully you guys will be able to identify it fairly easily, once you kind of get the 2 or 3 things that are very, very noticeable. Talk about some best, actually controlling and trying to eradicate the invasive species. And then also a little local case study from the Middle Lake area. So I'll talk about that. And then at the end, we'll just have some questions so you guys can ask me anything you want. So if you want to put the questions in the chat as we go, you can do that. And then I'll just try to cycle back to them at the end. Maybe Richard, if you want to keep track of those questions as they come in, or you can just save them till the end, whatever's easiest for you guys. So let's just see here. Make sure I have my little pointer. There we go. Okay, so just as a brief description of what Phragmites is essentially like a tall reed, and there are 2 different subspecies of Phragmites. So there's Phragmites australis, subspecies australis, which is the invasive version. And then we have Phragmites australis subspecies americanus, which is the native version that we just have here naturally in North America. And in Southern Ontario, the invasive version of the Phragmites has become very prevalent along like roadways and highways, especially. And you'll see it as you're driving by. You'll see these like super tall stands of these reeds essentially growing in the ditches and on the side of the road with these really large seed heads. And in Southern Ontario, most of what you see that looks like that on the side of the roads is the invasive version, but it has become more common along roadways in northeastern Ontario, as well as on Manitoulin Island. Especially there's an effort there to try to control it, and just like a lot of other invasive species, they tend to grow very dense stands, shade out other plants, and they're very persistent when they do establish. Now you can see from the picture here the seed heads are quite large, and those have roughly for each seed head about 2,000 seeds per seed head. But the seed viability is actually fairly low. So generally it's around 1%. So for each seed head, there's only maybe 20 seeds that are actually viable. And there has been some research that suggests the further north you go, the less viable the seeds become. So like other invasive species, it does actually tend to spread mainly through construction and disturbed sites where the root system or the rhizomes actually get picked up during construction. So construction of a roadway, and then it gets moved to a different site on the actual equipment and transferred to some other location. So generally you'll see it in those kinds of areas, like on the side of the roads, things like that. And they can grow very, very tall, while the native version tends to not grow as tall, which I'll talk about in the next slide here. So here we go. Yeah, so between the native and the invasive species, there are some key identifying features. I just put a little chart up here just for some of the main things to look at. Some of them are more easily identifiable. So when you actually see the stand itself, the invasive version tends to be much taller. So you'll see it 10 or 15 feet high in some cases, and it will just be a giant patch, like a big monoculture of the invasive Phragmites, while the native Phragmites will only grow about 2 meters or 6 feet tall, and it's generally a little bit more sparse. So you'll have some native vegetation growing in there, and it doesn't really, take over an area. It sort of grows naturally. Now, I will go in the next few slides. I'm going to show you some pictures of some of the other features to look out for. So some of those would be the actual stems themselves, because they have very distinct stem colors between the two, the invasive and the native. And then the leaf or the seed heads themselves are also much different when you actually look at the structure of them. One of them is much larger and one of them is a lot smaller. And if you're sort of unsure, if you do happen to see a patch, if you're just walking around somewhere and you happen to see a patch, and you want to actually look, later on online or something like that, it's always good to not take a picture of the whole patch itself, like a big widescreen shot. Try to take a picture of the stem itself, the leaves, and then the seed heads if they're even present, and then you can use that to reference it later. It just ends up being a little bit easier that way, because sometimes, if you have a big wide shot, it's sort of hard to pick out some of the identifying features. So that's just one thing to just sort of keep in mind.
Okay, it's afternoon and just
so here's just some photos here of the stems themselves. So on the left-hand side here, this is the native Phragmites. So it has almost like a chestnut red coloring on the stem, which is very distinct, and you can see it from the side of the road. This coloring, and the native or the invasive, sorry, in the middle here, you can see it has more of a tan color. It just goes green to tan. There's no red coloring in that at all, and that's one of the easiest ways to actually tell when you do see the stand of Phragmites. Whether it's the native or the invasive, when you look at the stem, that's a very easy thing to look at. Now, I will note, as the season progresses, as you get into the fall and into the winter, that red coloring will go away. So it doesn't stay red for the entire year, but it will have sort of a two-toned appearance. But just to keep that in mind, that it's not going to be there at all times, but it's very easy to tell most of the time with that red color. And that red color is also visible on the leaf collar. So if you sort of flip the leaf up, you can see that red coloring on the base of the leaf where it meets the stem. So that's also one way, versus the invasive version has more of a white to like a green, like a light green sort of coloring to it. And then we have up here just another identifying feature, and you would mostly notice this in the fall or late summer, when the leaves are starting to die off. With the native version, the leaf sheath, so as the leaf meets the stem, the sheath will like wrap around the stem, but as the season progresses and it gets into fall, it will sort of release from the stem. So you can kind of see it there. It almost looks like it's falling off. It's papery almost, while the invasive one will stay completely attached to the stem. And you can kind of notice it in some of these photos. It's a little bit hard to tell, but some of it is definitely noticeable for sure. So that's a couple of ways to look at it. Next, we'll just look at the flowering heads themselves. So not only what they look like, but when they actually start to flower. So when we're looking at the flowering season itself, for the native version, it tends to flower between July and August is when you start getting those seed heads on the top. So it's earlier than the invasive version. So the invasive version will start to seed in around mid-August to September. So it's a lot later than most other plants, and the native version as well. And if we look at the seed heads up close, the invasive one here is on the left, and it's very thick and very robust, while the native one is much more sparse. And the native one tends to have a more tan brown coloring. And in a lot of cases, the invasive one will have almost like a purple brown color to it. And it's, when you're driving by, sometimes it's really easy to see that purple brown coloring and just a really thick seed heads on them. So that's another thing to look for. So you can see down on the bottom right here, this is a native stand that is in the city. So we took some photos. So you can see that chestnut red coloring in the stems at the bottom. And then sort of that light tan colored seed heads. While at the top here, this is the invasive version, and the seed heads are much more full and look sort of like purpley brown. The coloring can vary, but it does have that purpley brown color. And if we just look closely at this photo, I just want to note this stem right here. If you can see that little red pointer, that stem is actually from the previous growing season. So it's very common to see the seed heads persist throughout the winter season. And then into the next year, you'll have this just brown stalk coming up with the seed head. And then obviously the new ones have green stems on them, but those seed heads do last for quite a while. I'm just going to take a drink of water here. So the other thing I just wanted to mention was actually the root system, not so much as an identifying feature, but just to show you what the root system of an established stand of invasive Phragmites looks like. So it's very thick. This is like 3/4 inch around. It's pretty thick, robust root system, and it will have shoots that come out along the stem. So when it comes to, we'll talk about it a little bit later when we talk about the best management practices for removal, but this is just something to remember when we do talk about that, because removal of the root system can be very difficult because of how robust it actually is. So just before we get into the removal techniques and best management practices around that, I just wanted to note the life cycle of the invasive version of Phragmites, and I'll mention it as we go through the different techniques as well. But obviously, it's dormant throughout the wintertime, November to March, and then into the springtime, it starts to germinate. And then in June through late July, you'll have, the primary vegetative growth stage. So it starts to shoot out all the stalks and sort of spread and get higher and higher. And then in August, so it could be generally mid-August, depending on where you are. It can be a little bit earlier, it can be a little bit later. So from August to September, it puts all of its energy into flowering and seed production. And then once that's finished in September through October, it starts to transport all its nutrients down to the root system for the next year. So just keep that in mind as we go forward when I talk about the next few slides here. So with removal techniques, I'll just talk about a few and then I'll focus on one of them in particular. So herbicide application is one of the ones that is generally only used on dry sites. So that would be glyphosate or imazapyr. So glyphosate is Roundup. So that's something that for like a community group to use, it's not something that's very easily accessible. It's not very cost effective because it requires, a licensed or authorized applicator. And it tends to be, much more expensive as well. Now if the site is suitable for herbicide application, you would generally do that in the late summer to early fall. And it will just kill everything that's sort of sprayed. So with Phragmites, the stands tend to be very dense. So you can't like hand wick each of the stalks. You have to spray the entire stand, and that will kill all the plants in the treatment area. So if there are native vegetation that happens to be growing in that area or around it, it will just kill it all in that area. And you can't use Roundup or glyphosate on anywhere near water. So it has been used like in the States, they do not have that restriction. So it's the herbicide application in the States is much more popular than in Canada. We have that restriction to not be able to use it in around water. But recently, in the past, I think a year and a half or 2 years, a different herbicide called Habitat Aqua has been approved by Health Canada after many years of research. They've finally got approved, and this is one that can be used for wet application, so on or near water. And it just gets sprayed on, and if it goes in the water, it breaks down, I believe through UV light, it just breaks down. So it has been approved, but I don't know of anybody who's used it yet, just through my research on that one. It's just recently been approved. So the next thing would be the selective cutting or the spading technique. So this would just be selectively cutting just the invasive Phragmites stalks themselves, and just working your way around any native vegetation that does happen to be growing in around the stand. And you're just cutting each stalk just below the surface. So you're not actually cutting that large root structure underneath. You're just cutting the stalks off of that, and then discarding or disposing of the stems, either by burning it or bringing it to the landfill and having it buried in a especially dug pit just for the disposal of the Phragmites. The good thing for this one is that it's, it doesn't require any special equipment. All you need is a shovel, a very sharp shovel, and it can be done easily by community groups. And it seems to be the most common one used by community groups, just for its low cost, but it is very labor intensive, especially with large stands. And you'll see in the case study on Minnow Lake, you'll see how large the stand can be and how dense it can be. So you can sort of imagine how labor intensive it would be. Now on Manitoulin Island especially, they have the Manitoulin Phragmites project, and they have many stands that are actually growing either right at the water's edge or in the water itself. So the spading technique, they can actually cut the stands that are underneath, that are in the water, 6 to 12 inches of water over top. And that flooding, it just sort of, it basically drowns the root system. So it actually helps with that. So that's something that for a wet site is good, but a lot of times we don't really see too many that are in the water itself, at least in our area anyways. But for Manitoulin Island, a lot of theirs do happen to be in the water. So it's sort of a combination of flooding it and the cutting and spading technique. Now, I will share some, or I have shared some links to with the group just for some other best management practices. So I just wanted to mention them that are in some of these documents. So one of them is tarping it. So many of you have probably heard of this. You just put a black tarp over the plants and it would just kill it. So if you're doing a garden or something similar, people would do that. But with Phragmites, you would have to cut all the stalks first. So you're basically doing the selective cutting or the spading technique. And then you would do this in the springtime, and then you would put a black tarp over it and just sort of weigh it down. And then that will block all the light out. And then also the heat throughout the summer will help kill any shoots that are coming up. Now, this technique is actually considered to be like low efficacy. It's not really the most ideal for managing the Phragmites. And for a large stand, you'd have to have quite a bit of tarping to actually do that. The other thing that is talked about in some of the best management practices documents are prescribed burns. But with prescribed burns, you need special permits to do that. And most of the sites wouldn't necessarily be suitable for prescribed burns. But I just wanted to mention those two because you will see them in some other best management practice documents. Now, when we look at all of these removal techniques, it's always a multi-year you have to look at the long term, because there's no silver bullet for just removing it in a single year. It's always multiple years to actually, kill the stand completely. So that's another thing just to keep in mind. So I have a graphic up here. So on the right-hand side, this is just an example from the Ontario Phragmites Working Group, just on how you actually do the spading technique. And it's essentially what it basically describes is you just use a spade and you cut the plant just a few inches underneath the soil, and you're just cutting the stem of it. And then you're pulling out the stems and you're either putting it in yard waste bags, if they're really small like this, or if they're really big, you'll have to dispose of it in a different way. So the spading technique was actually developed by Professor Lynn Short at Humber College, because I believe at her cottage, and some of her neighbors had issues with Phragmites on their beaches. So she sort of developed this technique as a low cost, easy way to remove the Phragmites, since it was right on their beach. They thought that this would be a good way to do it, and it proved to be quite successful. And it can be used, like I said, on dry land or in water. So you're not really disturbing too much of the soil this way by only getting the single stalk, instead of you're not digging up the whole site. You're just digging up each individual stalk, or cutting each individual stalk, rather than actually digging up the root system. Now, when you think about cutting the plant, you can cut it multiple times throughout the growing season. But when we think back to that life cycle diagram, if we do the cuttings in the early season, so June through to July, when it's in the primary growth stage, if you cut it, it will come back again. So depending on the situation, you can do it multiple times throughout the year, but you will continue to get new shoots. So in this example, these are relatively new shoots. They're fairly small, and you'll see in the next slide, you'll see what a very large established stand actually looks like. So cutting it down, it will weaken the stand. So as you do this over a number of years, the stand will weaken, and the root system won't be able to shoot out as many stalks, and the actual density of the stand will become less. So if you only have one time in the year to be able to do the cuttings, if you can't actually go back multiple times in the year, the best time to actually do the removal, the spading technique, would be in August to September, when the plant has stopped putting all its energy into vegetative growth and started to put its energy into seed creation or seed production, because then you'll have less shoots that will come up. So if you're only going to do it once, then it would be, the best time would be around August through September. And yeah, it depends on the stand size, how you would actually dispose of the material. So in this case, they're using just small yard waste bags, and they're leaving them in the sun, and then they're going to burn them afterwards. But for a large stand, that might not be feasible. So bringing it to the landfill and having it in especially a dug pit that's over 1 meter deep as a minimum, sort of, but generally deeper is better. And then you can dispose of it that way. So, or it can be disposed of that way. But it is a very labor-intensive process to do the spading technique. So in this case, it's a small stand, but as you start cutting the stand back and it comes back less dense and less dense, it becomes easier to manage. But in some cases, it can be very daunting as a first step. So I'll just go to the next slide here. So we're just going to talk about a little local case study that happened this year on the Middle Lake Boardwalk. So we have Stephen Monet, who's the manager at the city of the Sudbury for environmental planning initiatives, And you can see here, this is a large stand of very established stand of invasive Phragmites. So if you look closely, you can see over in the bottom left corner here, you can see that tan stem for identifying it, and you can see the previous year's seed heads kind of interspersed in here. But you can see how tall this is. So this is it was probably about 10 feet tall, 10 or 11 feet tall. It was pretty big. So this was done, like I said, on the Minnow Lake Boardwalk on Bancroft, just across from the Carmichael Arena. So the Minnow Lake Restoration Group brought this to our attention through the Lake Stewardship Grant Program and the city's Environmental Planning Initiatives Program wanted to take this on as a pilot project to see the effectiveness of this spading technique. So you can sort of see the extent here. This is the main stand, and it was fairly dense, and there were a few patches down here as well, but this is sort of the main area. Now this is just the first year of a multi-year project, because it will take multiple years to get this stand, to eradicate this stand through this technique. But after one season, here's a little bit more of a HD photo. This is the work area, and again, it went further down to the right here, but you can see that it was growing all in here. Basically, all this exposed soil was where the invasive Phragmites was, and it was also growing in here. But we do have some native vegetation growing, and there's some planted shrubs here that were planted in the past growing within it, but they weren't doing so well, just being so shaded out by the Phragmites. Now, we did the removal in the first week of August, and we had the city's regreening crew complete the removal. So it took 20 staff about 4 full days to complete all the removal and dispose of all the stalks and make sure the area was all cleaned up. So the Phragmites, we had all hands on deck to remove the stand, and then it was all brought to the landfill. So we coordinated with them to have a specially dug pit, and then we transported it in an enclosed cube van. So there was no chance of it spreading anywhere else. And then the truck was swept out at the landfill and into the pit. So made sure that everything was properly buried and disposed of. So I'll show a couple of photos here of the work and actually being done. So here's Stephen again, just directing the regreening crew, just giving them some instructions on how to do the removal, because you do have to be fairly surgical with your removal, because you want to disturb the soil as little as possible, and you want to just cut the stem and try not to lift up any of the rhizome or the root system. So you can see he's here in the stand working, and it's quite daunting when we first started, because it was quite a large stand. So even for 20 people, it was quite the process to do the removal. So I'll show a couple other photos here. So this was on the second day. So they were able to basically cut an opening through, and you see this big pile of Phragmites that was cut, and that was all moved into a cube van, an enclosed cube van for removal. But you can see that there was a few shrubs that were starting to appear here. And this is a little bit further down the bank, and you can see those planted shrubs have finally appeared. And we did have a few stalks growing in the water, and those were removed. And we did have somebody always in the water. As we were getting near the water, we had somebody there making sure that none of the fragments, none of the rhizomes, no piece of vegetation was floating away and getting anywhere else, because it's really important that we capture everything to make sure that it doesn't spread anywhere else on the lake. So we were very careful about that to make sure it didn't spread any further. So you can see, yeah, like this is the very tail end of the stand itself, and then it gets more dense as you go further this way. Now this was on the last day. There was just a few stalks that needed to be that were growing in with these cattails. There were a few stalks in there, but you can see that the whole area was filled with Phragmites. And there were some shrubs, but not all of them survived. You can see there's a dead one here. So it was shading out some those shrubs that were there. And we made sure to, this is it on the very last day after we had cleaned up. So we had everybody on the crew went around and made sure that there was no bits of rhizome. As we were picking up all the seed heads, everything that we could to make sure that, you know, we weren't inadvertently spreading anything. But you can see that, you know, that's quite a stark difference from the original you know, location, what it looked like before we actually did the removal. Now, I did say that this was the first year of a multi-year project, so this could take 4 or 5 or 6 years to actually fully eradicate this stand, because you can imagine what the root system is like underneath here, and regrowth is bound to happen, and that's actually what did happen. So we did the removal the first week of August, and on August 25th, which is the left-hand photo here, you can see that there is regrowth happening. And then there's a September 1st photo as well. All of that regrowth has already occurred in such a short amount of time. So what we sort of learned from this was we may have went maybe 2 or 3 weeks earlier than originally anticipated, because we wanted to catch it just as the seed heads were coming up. But with the regreening crew, they had other projects that needed to be completed. So we figured we'll try it the first week of August, and then we'll see how that goes, and then we'll reevaluate for the next years. So obviously there is regrowth that has happened. Now these stalks won't reach full height like they did in what it looked like originally, and they won't produce seeds either. So there is some benefit to that, and the density of the stems themselves, the whole stand density, the more you cut it, the weaker the root system gets, the less dense the stand gets as well. So as we go forward in future years, the stand will hopefully become less and less dense and easier to manage as the years go by. So for the first year, I think this was a good, definitely a good thing for us to take on, because it was quite a bit of work. It was very labor intensive, but you know, going back next year and years following, hopefully it will be a little bit easier to manage. So the last thing I just want to mention, just to sort of wrap it up before we go into the questions, is I did send this around to Susan and Alex. I sent it around in a Word document. So don't worry too much about not being able to click on the links. I did send them all the links so they can hopefully share it with the rest of you guys. But one of them that I really wanted to highlight was the Manitoulin Phragmites project, because it's very local to us. And they've been doing a lot of work on Manitoulin Island, trying to, you know, get the community involved and do the removal, because they do have quite a bit of Phragmites there, it seems. So I believe Judith is the coordinator for that. So I do have their information in that Word document to their Facebook page, so you can contact them, which would be good. We also have the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. So this is the US and Canadian partners for this, and they have a really great website with a really extensive webinar series. So there's all kinds of pre-recorded webinars on that website, as well as all kinds of other useful information, all kinds of different you know, fact sheets and things like that. So that's also a really good place to start. And there is a webinar there on the spading technique itself by the one who actually created the spading technique. So that might be something you you'll be interested to check out as well. And then, getting a little bit more local, we have the Ontario Phragmites Working Group, which is just Ontario specific for the Phragmites removal, which is, I believe, a working group of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. So there's a link there, but all of these links are available for you to look at through that Word document, and hopefully you can look at some of that webinar series. And I believe there's also a webinar coming up through the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. I can't recall if it's in January or February, but on Phragmites. So that might be something that you're interested in. And I think I forget if it was Richard or Susan who brought that up to me. So that's something that you guys might be interested in as well. So for questions, any questions? I'll look at the chat here.
Do you want to start that with me? Would you like to start that with my questions?
Yep.
Sure.
I was just
Okay.
going to say, John's had his hand up for quite a while.
Where's John? Where's John? I don't even see him. Go ahead, Susan.
John Gall, did you not have your hand up for a while?
No,
Okay,
I had it on my face. I didn't
Oh,
have it.
you got your little
ask a
yellow
question.
hand up. Okay.
anyway, I just
No.
want to say, number one, thank you for a wonderful presentation. That was really very worthwhile. And I would like to come back a little bit of history with McFarland Lake, Long Lake, and Richard Lake, which deals with Eurasian milfoil. And, since 1958, we've had Eurasian, I'm just saying this as a background. We've had Eurasian milfoil for ever since then, 1958. And anyway, we are now dealing with Phragmites, and this is really a concern. We have Phragmites apparently that has been picked up on South Lane Road, Highway 69, South Lane Road. So it's not like anything different from the Eurasian milfoil that we kept saying, oh, beware, beware, beware. But anyway, it's a bit of a concern, and it's extended, of course, along Highway 69 and South Lane Road. And I heard in the presentation, Manitoulin, what is the city doing looking into this now? There's all kinds of questions. It's not anything easy to answer, but if we have Phragmites coming into McFarland Lake, which will eventually go into Long Lake, all down the watershed, what are we doing about that? So I'm not sure if there's anybody on this call that can answer that question.
It's definitely a
Hey, Sandy, nice to see you.
it's definitely a tricky question, but for Manitoulin Island, it does seem like there's a lot of the Phragmites, well, just in the Great Lakes in general, growing along the shorelines there. But in Greater Sudbury, the Minnow Lake one is the only one that I know of, at least on the shoreline of the lake, that's growing right on the shoreline. But there certainly is some on the
So there
road.
has been Phragmites sightings on South Lane and Highway
Oh yeah, on the
69.
roadways there are certainly stands along the roadways in multiple areas in and around the Greater Sudbury area. But I just was mentioning just on along the shorelines in particular, just for that portion of it, anyways. Yeah.
So maybe it's Stephen speaking. Maybe I can answer some of that, or provide a bit of an answer that. So we've been recently looking into adopting more of an integrated approach to Phragmites control. We have tried herbicide at one location during a road repair, and that has been successful. But again, it has to be multi-year, and that's an issue. Glyphosate or Roundup was applied in that instance. And to my understanding, it was reapplied the following year as well. It works quite successfully on Phragmites, but again, I want to reiterate it is multi-year, whatever technique is used. Now, with the advent of Habitat Aqua that has just been approved by Health Canada, actually in March of this year, although it's been used in the United States for quite a number of years, it promises to be somewhat of a game changer because it is much more effective on Phragmites than glyphosate ever was. And as I said, we are looking at adopting more of an integrated approach. The first part of that approach is to be able to identify where the stands are. And that's the approach certainly that MTO, I have engaged them in that discussion as well for our area specifically. And so the roads that they're responsible for, they have shown interest in managing Phragmites. The first step is identifying where the stands are located and then working along with them. And as well as internally, we still are, trying to figure out a cost-effective means of attempting control in our area. I believe personally that there's still a chance that we are able to eradicate it within our municipal boundaries. Thankfully, it is not a rapid spreader, but it does spread because of road repairs. So mud from one area is transferred to another area, equipment isn't properly cleaned, etc. So we need to, again, I don't want to overuse the word, but really an integrated approach of being able to identify the stands and able to apply the appropriate technique. So that's
so just Stephen, just as a question for you, has the city not identified that there is a problem on South Lane and Highway 69 with this Phragmites?
Yeah, there are there are some stands on Highway 69. There are some stands leading up into Regent Street as well. Yes, there are some stands there for sure.
Stephen, if I could ask a couple of questions, you can answer them in one. Habitat, the herbicide, where can we get that? I guess one question. And second question would be the one around Minnow Lake. Is it being buzzed by the staff when they cut the grass there? Are they trimming it down so that it slowly dies out? I guess would be another question on that.
No, actually, mowing it is not an effective technique for removal. So we prefer to do it. We realize this is the first year of a multi-year treatment. So we're going to be attempting to do somewhat of the same thing next year. Whether we are able to secure a permit to apply Habitat Aqua. So there's a number of things that need to happen. We need to have folks that are licensed to apply the product. We need to have license from the MECP to apply the product. We will likely need as well letter of advice from the Minister of Natural Resources, or I forget exactly what they're called now. They're rolled in with the MNDM. So there's a number of different steps that need to occur. This is not necessarily going to be a short turnaround. But we're certainly committed to the Minnow Lake group that we're looking at that site in particular in order to do this multi-year treatment at that location.
Thanks, Stephen. I just want to go up to the people who have their hands raised. Susan, I think you've got the next question.
All right, thank you. I'll put my hand down. I was just interested, Taylor, when you were describing the spading technique, and once or twice you mentioned, being careful of the surrounding earth or not disturbing things too much. So often when you're trying to get rid of an invasive plant, you want to take out the root system and the spreading rhizomes and everything. So that's confusing me. Do you not try to dig out the roots of
Yeah.
Phragmites?
Yeah, so you try to avoid digging out the roots because the root system is so robust that if you were to, you would have to remove like everything around it to get the root system completely out. And the rhizomes, so how it spreads, like Stephen was saying, through construction is those rhizomes can attach itself to, you know, the tracks on some construction equipment or get on there, and it's the rhizomes that can spread, or is the most easily for it to spread to a different location. So you want to prevent that as much as possible. So as you cut the stems down, you're weakening the stand as a whole. So that's why it takes multiple years, because there is energy stored in that root system. And you want to just slowly deplete that over time as you're cutting down the stems. So you don't want that. If we think back to that life cycle slide, you don't want the actual stand to start sending nutrients down into the root system. You want to cut it before it starts doing that, so you deplete all of that nutrients that's in the rhizomes themselves.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Nick,
Would
I
it
think
be-
you're next.
Would it be feasible in larger areas to go in with for time saving with, let's say, a chainsaw and then heavy equipment to get rid of the topsoil, so that way it gets rid of as much as possible in a short amount of time?
So that you can't excavate the entire area with like heavy equipment, but in that case, it's actually disposing of the material becomes very difficult to do, because you have to remove all of that topsoil, right?
Mhm.
And like a lot of invasive species, they thrive in a disturbed area. So if you just start disturbing the soil, it ends up making the native species, it will have a harder time establishing, and then that invasive Phragmites will just thrive more. So yeah, it's recommended just to disturb the soil as little as possible. So that's why they do the spading technique, where you're just removing just the stalk. And obviously like you could see in the photos, you're still disturbing the soil a little bit because the stands can be so dense, but you're just trying to minimize it as much as possible. So yeah, like doing what you said wouldn't be recommended.
Okay.
Thanks, Taylor. Mary, you had your hand up. Did you decide to not ask your question?
No, Susan and Nicholas both had similar questions. So yeah, I didn't catch that part during your presentation. Thank you, Taylor, for your presentation, but I didn't catch that part about the robustness of the root system. So yeah, I was with Nicholas on get some digger bug in there and get that root system out of there.
Yeah.
But now my question has been answered. Thank you.
Okay, Mandy, you're next.
Okay, this is going more back to its habitat niche and, what we should be trying to avoid. I think what we're seeing here, perhaps because it's most evident, is the Phragmites that's along the roadside easements or the ditches or Minnow Lake. But in other jurisdictions, where I've traveled or been on presentations, it's invading wetlands and critical habitat like that and is very relentless. And you're saying it, it most commonly comes in on construction equipment. So is there any move afoot to try and prevent that? Something like a boat hull, the clean, dry, whatever it is, that equipment has, before they go into one of these sensitive areas. And I'm even thinking of the recharge areas in Ramsey Lake watershed, down by Laurentian University in the lake, or, these places that have quite vibrant small ecosystems with our native bulrushes that support the red-winged blackbirds, etc. That could easily become habitat for Phragmites. And is there any kind of push at, say, city, if there's going to be construction, that the equipment that's going in there is, I don't know how you clean construction equipment, but
there actually is, well, to answer your question, there actually is clean construction documents and standards. So through all of our contracts, we do require that. So for the contractors to properly clean their equipment before coming to site as well as before leaving the site. So to prevent any spread of any invasive species. So that is something that is available, and that is being done. But of course, sometimes things get missed, or things do spread, unfortunately. But yeah, you are right that there are documents and guidelines for cleaning construction equipment and inspecting it to make sure that you avoid any spread of the invasive species.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Ruth, you're next.
Thank you, Taylor, for a very interesting presentation. I'm just wondering, I know that the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, has a place on their website where you can report sightings of various and sundry invasive species. And I know you and Stephen both mentioned, where there are Phragmites growing in various places around Sudbury. Does the city have a register where people can call in and say, hey, I saw some of this Phragmites at this location?
We don't have for Phragmites. We do have that for giant hogweed, which is another invasive plant. There is the EDS or the EDDS maps, which I did link to in that last slide, and I did share with the group. So that is one way to report the locations of those stands. So there is definitely ways to do that for sure, but we don't have one at the city itself for that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Oh, Elaine, you're next.
Sorry, Richard, maybe I can just add to
Yep.
that question regarding the mapping. So it was a number of years ago, I think it was with the Invasive Council. And I noticed on their website that they had images relating to Phragmites, but in some of the northern areas, like our area, they were showing clearly what was the native Phragmites. So I brought that to their attention, saying, you're painting a bleaker picture than what it actually is. And they were surprisingly unaware that there were two subspecies, one native and one fairly aggressive non-native. So I think they've since corrected that, which basically heightens the need for having, an accurate identification to begin with, because we certainly don't want to be painting all Phragmites with the same brush that they need to be removed, because that clearly is not the case, nor would it be a desirable end. So again, that identification is all important right at the start.
Thanks for that clarification, Stephen. Over to you, Elaine.
Hi. I'm just wondering, Taylor, if how important the spread of the Phragmites is by the seeds. We're talking mostly about the stems, but how much should we worry about the seeds as well?
Yeah, so the seeds themselves, I did sort of mention this just in the start. The seeds are not the main way that it does spread. It can spread through the seeds, but the seed viability is extremely low, so it's around 1%. So like in one seed head, there would be roughly 2,000 or so seeds on there, and only 1% of those are actually viable seeds. So it can spread through seeds. But it's just the viability is less. And there has been some research that shows, the further north you go, the less viable the seeds become, just for reference there.
Piece of good news in the midst of all the other problems. Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any further hands up, but are there other questions that you'd like to ask Taylor while he's here?
I could. Yeah, Richard, if I could, Normidi here, Taylor, with what's happening out in BC right now, floodplain mapping within the city, is that under your purveyance, or is that emergency preparedness Sudbury, or who is that? Because all the studies now saying that the floodplains have been growing and changing quite a bit, and we know we're going to get hit here. So future presentations we're talking about looking at in the future, who could bring us up to speed about how, I know from my own experience, the lower Wanapate, and there's a whole bunch of areas that are really at risk. And if we get something that they get, which hopefully we don't, is that your department or through Stephen, or what department would that be under?
Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the floodplain mapping is through Conservation Sudbury. Is that correct, Stephen?
Yes, that's correct. So they have a responsibility in Ontario with floodplain mapping.
So
So
Lynn,
you may be able to ask Anoop from Conservation Sudbury, and he wouldn't be the main one, but I could reach out to see if you want, or you can just reach out to I know Richard, you're probably in contact with Anoop as well. Go to speaker perhaps.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for the presentation, Taylor. It was great.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for having me. And if you have any other follow-up questions, you can of course send me an email or give me a call for anything else as well.
I just wanted to thank you again, Taylor. And as I guess the financial officer, you probably heard already that we are, and let Stephen know also, that we are going to donate in your name as to recognize this fine session we've had, a donation to the Ontario Invasive Plant Council of $50 as a token of thanks to you.
That's very nice. Thank you very much.
You have a question, Mandy?